In today's lecture, we're going to start Chapter 4, which is all about genes, evolution, and behavior. Now, as per always, when we're starting a chapter, we can start with some of our basic definitions. So when we're talking about evolution, we're going to be talking about a change in heritable traits in a population over time. And we're going to break down all of these components throughout this lecture. So heritable means something that you are inheriting. If we're looking at these traits in a population, so it's going to be in a particular group of organisms, and these things are changing over time. And we're going to see a couple of different examples of how natural selection is working throughout this chapter. And the process by which evolution occurs is what we're going to call natural selection. And you might have heard the term natural selection in all sorts of places. It's a pretty common term, sometimes also called survival of the fittest. And we'll get into the details of all of how natural selection works, at least our simplified version of it for a psychology intro course, further on into the chapter. But first we want to start on building up some basics and getting a decent understanding of what we're going to be talking about before we get into these sort of processes. And so we've already talked about what behavior is. So behavior is an organism's action in response to some stimulus. And a stimulus can be any type of force. So our example down here is if you are outside and it's cold, maybe it starts snowing, your behavior could be to put on a hat. So the stimulus here is that change in temperature or the starting of snow. Those would both be a stimulus. A stimulus being some generic term for anything really. A sound, a smell, even a thought. It doesn't have to be external. A stimulus is whatever it is that's driving your behavior. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So when we're talking about evolution and these changes in heritable traits, as psychologists, we're really going to care about heritable traits in terms of those traits being behaviors. It's a lot easier to visualize a trait as something physical, like your height. Height is a trait that tends to be genetically inclined or prone to evolution and natural selection. So it's a little bit easier to visualize something like that, but we also care about how behaviors can evolve. Because of course we can. As psychologists, we care tons about behavior. So that's going to be our main focus, but we will use physical traits that are a little bit easier to quantify as examples as well, just to keep everything a little bit clearer. So if we're going to be talking about this heredity, which I've kind of hand-waved a little bit so far, we're going to need to talk a little bit of technical terms here. So first off, we're going to talk about genes, and genes are going to be our basic unit of heredity. So genes are how quote-unquote stuff is passed from parent to offspring. So if someone has ever told you, you look like your mother, it's because you share genes with your mother. There's genetic material that has been shared that gives you similar physical characteristics to your mother. So if we talk about you are inheriting something, which has the same root as this heredity, so if you're inheriting something, you're receiving it from an ancestor. You are getting it from someone further back in your genetic line, someone who's related to you. So when we talk about something being hereditary, you are inheriting it from your parents. And so when we're talking about our genetic information, when we're talking about our genes, we're mostly talking about DNA. And so this is our units, our representation of that genetic material. So our DNA is hereditary. It is inherited from our parents. It's made up of bases. And if you've taken biology, either in high school or as a university course, you probably know all about adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. These are our 4 bases. So we have A, T, G, and C. Got to say them in the right order. Just abbreviated by the first letter of each of the bases' names. And the order of these bases, how we see them, is going to contain and store information. So our genes are made up of very precisely ordered groupings of these bases. And so for this lecture, you're going to see quite a few of these FYI slides. And these slides are just for your information. It's not something that you need to memorize. It's not something you need to know, but I'm including it because these visuals sometimes help you put together what we're talking about. So here we can see that we have adenine and thymine, and this is what DNA looks like. You have your phosphate deoxyribose backbone. Goodness gracious. So this is just a sugar backbone with our bases in the middle, and they pair up in predictable fashions. Adenine with thymine, so A with T, and guanine with cytosine, G and C. And so we have 2 strands. So this side here, actually I can circle it, this side here is going to be 1 strand of our DNA, and it goes from our 5' end to our 3' end, which is more than we really need to know. But we also have this other side, which runs in the opposite direction. And these 2 are giving us basically the same information, just read in 2 different directions. So when we're looking at our DNA, you might be more used to seeing it kind of like this here, where it's that helix. This blue ribbon is that sugar backbone, and then these G's, C's, A's, and T's are our bases. This is just another way of representing. So for this course, we don't care so much about how they bond together and what shape each of our bases are, but I do find that sometimes this helps people visualize what it is that we're seeing when we're looking at these more simplified diagrams of what our DNA looks like. And so if our DNA is made up of these series of bases that are in particular orders, and if those orders mean something, then we can kind of scale up on what we're looking at, sort of move steps backwards away to look at the larger picture. So at this image here, we can talk about our genes contained within our DNA. So the order of the bases is going to make up our genes. And these genes are segments of DNA that contain instructions that make proteins. So the order of those bases determine our genes, and the genes are specifically going to code for or give us instructions for making particular molecules. And we're going to call those molecules proteins, and proteins are the basic building blocks of life. Proteins are what make up the pigments that give us our hair and skin color. Proteins make up the cells in our body. Proteins are part of basically everything that we do. Our hormones are proteins. Our cells are made of proteins. Proteins are life. So our genes are giving us the instructions for those proteins, and our genes are made up of our DNA. And so with all of those genes and all of that DNA coming together, if we take our step backwards, we have chromosomes. So chromosomes are going to exist in pairs, and each chromosome has lots of genes on it. So a chromosome is going to be a tightly coiled up string of DNA. So if you imagine this is us looking at a very, very tiny level, so we got a bunch of our A's, T's, C's, and G's, and then our strings of DNA could kind of look like this, but if they're going to turn into chromosomes, they start winding up, they start condensing, and when they condense like this, they, instead of being long and skinny and pretty much invisible, even under microscopes, when they're condensed like this, we can actually see them as chromosomes. And so these chromosomes are just densely packed DNA. And I've mentioned that every chromosome is going to exist as a pair. And the way that we get these pairs is that one copy is going to have come from your mother, and one copy has come from your father. So when you have two chromosomes, you have a pair of chromosomes, one came from each of your parents. And so if we take another step back, within our cells, we have a nucleus, which is the area that holds all the really important information. And so our nucleus is made up or contains 46 chromosomes. So we get 23 pairs of chromosomes. So if we get 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 from your father, there are 46 total, and they exist as pairs. So we could look at this one here and this one here. This one comes from your mother, and this one comes from your father. And we could match them up because our different chromosomes are going to look just a little bit different. And people who go off into genetics might start looking at pictures of our chromosomes and learn how to match them up and put them in the right order using what is called a karyotype, which is just a picture of all of the chromosomes within your cell. But again, a little bit beyond our class. We're just going to stick with knowing that within each nucleus within our cell, we're going to have 46 chromosomes, and those are made up of 23 pairs. And so, like we've said, the nucleus is what's housing those chromosomes within our cells, and most of our cells, almost all of our cells, will have a nucleus. There are some exceptions. Red blood cells are weird because when they mature, they no longer have a nucleus. But pretty much everything else is going to have a nucleus with those 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. So we're not going to care too much about the exceptions. And then if we think about it again, take another step back, our human body contains about 100 trillion cells. So if each cell has this many chromosomes and we have that many cells, we have so much genetic information within our bodies that it's not even funny. But this kind of gives you an idea of the hierarchy or the orientation of how all of this stuff fits together. And it's introducing you to a couple of new terms, which we're going to keep on using throughout this lecture and throughout the rest of the course. All right, so we're going to start looking at what it means to inherit different chromosomes and different genes on different chromosomes from your parents. So we're going to start looking at some very simplified chromosomes here. So these cartoonish X's, these are going to be our chromosomes. So that's my equivalent of these guys here, which you're going to see over here. And so if your father gives you 23 chromosomes and your mother gives you 23 chromosomes, and those are going to form the 46 chromosomes that make up your genetic material. So those are pairs, 23 pairs of chromosomes to get that 46 here. We can look at just one pair of chromosomes. So say we're going to look at chromosome 1. So chromosome 1. And on chromosome 1, we're going to look at a specific gene that's on each of these chromosomes. So if we're looking at gene B, that's just going to be our stand-in. We're going to look at gene B and see how we can inherit gene B. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm actually only going to be looking at sort of one of these guys, because that's all that really matters for our simplicity's sake. So if we're looking at just sort of half of that, get a nice simple representation here. If you get gene B on chromosome 1 from your father and gene B on chromosome 1 from your mother, you end up with 2 copies of gene B. And for sake of argument, for our example here, let's say that gene B is going to help determine our eye pigment color. So gene B has a set of instructions that will help our body make a protein, and that protein is the pigment that determines eye color. So that's how this gene is working on this particular chromosome. Now, not everybody has the same version of gene B. So the version of gene B that you have is going to determine which color pigment you produce. And when we talk about a version of a gene, we can also call it an allele. So you might have one allele that makes you produce brown pigment and would give you brown eyes, or you might have a different allele that produces a different pigment that gives you a different color. So maybe blue or green, depending on which allele or which version of this gene that you have. And so if we're going to give some other terminology here, if we want to talk about which version of a gene is the quote unquote natural version, if we're talking about what is the most common in the population, what has existed for the longest in the population, we bring it back to evolution, which version evolved first, we can call that the wild type allele. So it's wild type because it's what you see most often in the wild. So for eye color, our wild type allele is actually brown eyes. So brown eyes is the natural, the pre-existing version of this gene. So we can say that if you inherited a wild type allele from your father, you're going to have that original or unmutated or unevolved or unchanged version of the gene. And this wild type allele is going to code for or have the instructions for brown pigment, which would mean that you would have brown eyes. So we can say that the wild type allele of gene B produces brown eyes. So that's the original version of the gene. What if we have another version of the gene? So we can say that if you inherited a mutant allele, so something other than the wild type, a version of the gene that's changed a little bit, that's going to produce a different pigment. So if you get this mutant allele from your mother, you're going to have a modified version of the gene. And since the original version of the gene made a brown pigment, then this version probably is going to make a different kind of pigment. And so in this case, it's going to make a pigment that lets you have blue eyes. So this mutant allele, this changed or mutated allele, is going to give us a different version, a modified version of the gene. So we're producing a different protein, and that different protein is a different pigment. And so we're going to say, okay, well, if you get the gene that says brown eyes from your father, and you got a gene that says blue eyes from your mother, what do we actually see in a person? What do we observe in your appearance? And so we can have a little bit more terminology here. And if we know what gene you have. So if we have a brown eye allele, we have the brown eyes wild type version of the gene from your father, and the blue eyes allele, the mutant version of the gene from your mother, we know what genes you have. And if we're looking at what genes you have, we can call that a genotype. We know what type of genes there are. And so we can ask, well, if we know this genotype, if we know what genes you have, what does that mean for your physical appearance? And if we want to see your physical appearance, we have another term for that, and that is your phenotype. So what observable trait can we see? And in this case, if you have a brown eye allele from one parent and a blue eye allele from the other, we end up seeing that the child will have brown eyes. So the pattern here is that this pigment, the protein produced by this particular allele for that gene, is stronger than this one. So we see the phenotype of brown eyes. So we see the physical quality of brown eyes, even though our genotype, the genes that we're looking at, are one brown and one blue. The observed outcome is going to be brown only. And so when we're talking about that phenotype, when we're looking at what we're observing in the end, we can make some conclusions based on that pattern that we just saw. So because the brown pigment was stronger, we can say that brown eyes allele, the brown eyes allele, that wild type allele, is dominant over the blue eyes allele. So brown is stronger than blue. So we're going to see this pigment better than we would this one if we have the genes for both. And we can look at it the other way. So we're saying that brown eyes is dominant over blue eyes. We can also say that blue eyes is recessive to brown eyes. And both of these are telling us that if we have one brown eye allele and one blue eye allele, we're only going to see a brown-eyed phenotype. So our genotype isn't always the same as our phenotype. Now, if we were going to have a couple of other examples, just to make this a little bit clearer, so let's say instead of getting a blue eyes allele from your mother, what if you got a brown eyes? Brown. So you have a brown eye allele from your father and one from your mother, you're still going to see brown eyes in the child. So both copies are brown, so we're seeing brown. And in that case, our genotype is the same as our phenotype. There's no weird differences there. And we can go the other way. What if instead of getting brown eye allele from your father, what if you got the blue eye allele? Well, if we have blue from one parent and blue from the other, we actually end up seeing blue in the child. So a recessive trait, the less strong version, this blue eye allele, shows up in the phenotype if you have two copies of that allele. So a recessive trait, like having blue eyes, can still be seen if you have two copies of that recessive allele. Whereas our dominant allele, having brown eyes, you'll see that dominant version even if you only have one copy. And that's because this one is dominant over that one. And those are the very basics of how we can look at patterns of inheritance. And keep in mind this difference between genotype and phenotype, where genotype is the type of genes that you have, which version of the genes you have, and the phenotype is going to be the physical, observable trait that you end up with on the other side. And so here we have another FYI slide. So again, you don't have to remember this. I just find sometimes it helps. So when we're talking about all of those really long lengths of DNA, and we say that there are genes in that DNA, there is also other things in the DNA. So we can have these blocks of genes. So maybe this gene is telling us the pigment for our eye color. Maybe this gene helps produce a particular hormone. Maybe this gene is involved in generating the stuff we need to have hair. Genes for everything. And then in between each of these genes is what's called noncoding DNA. And that's basically DNA that isn't part of a gene and isn't really doing anything. So you'll sometimes see this non-coding DNA also called junk DNA because it doesn't seem to have any purpose. Though the further you go into genetics, the more you realize that there might be something going on in here, but we're still not quite sure. So that's a pretty cool place to start looking. But if we look at our long string of DNA, there are patches that are genes that are coding for particular proteins. Then you have the stretches that don't really do anything. Then you have some more genes. And each of those genes is coding for or is providing the instructions to make different proteins. And like we said, proteins can be antibodies or enzymes or hormones or structural bits or pigments, or you get the idea. They can be pretty much anything. And so all of the bits and pieces that make up our body are coming from these proteins that come from our genes, which is pretty cool when you think about